this is what happened. We've all said that from time to time when we tell our own stories. But I wonder, who decides what to include in a story? Who decides what to leave out? Who decides when the story begins and when it ends? Today, I want to share with you a traditional Irish tale about a magical Halloween night and what happened to an old couple in Donegal in the north of Ireland. Let's use that story as a way to explore the power and the potential of storytelling itself. And let me point out, that is a power that you have, my friends, and that you can use to tell your story in a way that leaves you feeling happy, proud, and, dare I say it, at least a little bit magical. So, Donncha Ó Baoill, welcome, my friends. I'm so happy that you're here with me, and I'm happy that I'm here with you. If this is your first time joining us, my name is Kate, and I am a professor of Irish language and folklore, and I'm also a lover of stories and what they can do for us and how they bring us together. So I want to tell you this story. Let me just tell you briefly that it comes from a collection called scéal oatmeal, which means the fairy legends of Donegal. And honestly, there's no book like it. It's really the largest collection of fairy legends in Europe. And it was put together by my hero, a man called Sean O'Chathy. The story I'm going to tell you was collected from a school teacher called Donncha Ó Baoill. And like everyone in the collection, Donncha was born sometime in the 19th century. All the stories were collected between 1935 and 1955. And Donncha was himself a storyteller and a teacher. So let me tell you the story and then we'll talk it over. Fado I dtír chonal, Ihe hauna a bhían. Once long ago in County Donegal, it was Halloween night, and Peggy was cleaning the house. Her husband Neil was sitting by the fire as comfortable as can be, puffing on his pipe, reflecting on all the work that he'd done all season to bring in the harvest and about all of the lovely relaxation and entertainment that he would have until spring came. Well, Peggy was just about to make them some supper, and she went over to draw a little bit of meal out of the oatmeal chest. And when she put her hand into it, she felt a shock of dismay, because it was nearly empty. There was just a little bit of dust and some shavings and straws at the bottom of the chest. And she said, "Oh, Neil, this is nearly empty." And he said, "Ah, Peggy dear, don't you worry. A store like that is often drawn upon does run dry." And she said, "Well, that's true, but how sad for us, because honestly, we can make do with the potatoes, but it's lovely to have a little bit of stir-about oatmeal in the evening, on the cold winter evening." He said, "Ah, well, we'll be fine. Why don't you just put some spuds in the ashes and we'll have our dinner?" And she said, "Well, we haven't enough. I'd like you to go out to the barn and get a few more because we need to boil them up for the hens in the morning." And Neil was none too happy to be rousted out of his comfortable warm place by the fire, but he said, "Toss me those old boots." And he put them on, and out he went into the night. And Peggy went over to the fire to stir it up, to put another fresh bit of water on the pot, and suddenly she felt a presence in the room with her. And out of the corner of her eye, she could see a little woman standing by the door. And her breath caught in her chest, and she hardly knew what to say. It was such a surprise, but she kept her manners about her, and she turned and she said, "Welcome, Fáilteach, welcome, and why don't you sit here by the fire and warm yourself?" And she observed the little woman. The woman had dark, sparkling, merry eyes under thick black brows, and she had a long pointed nose, and she had nut brown skin that was all wrinkled and worn. And she looked right at Peggy and said, "I didn't come for the warmth from your fire. I came for a cup of meal from your oatmeal chest." "Ah," Peggy said, there's nothing I would like to do more than please you, but we really have just about run out. Nevertheless, all I've got is just this little bit at the bottom, a little bit of dust and shavings, a few oats, but I'll give you what I have." And so she filled up the little cup that the woman held out and said, "I'm sorry it's not more. I'm sure you have people to feed just as I do, but take it and gladly." And the old woman went over to the meal chest and she took out a little stick that she had hanging from a little leather thong at her waist, and she said a few words in a language Peggy didn't know, and she tapped the chest, and she turned back to Peggy and she said, "Now, that chest will always be full from here on out, but do this one thing. Never let another person lay their hands on that chest. Otherwise, my charm will be broken and the meal will disappear." And almost in the twinkling of an eye, she was gone. Well, a moment later, Neil came in blustering from the cold and carrying a handful of potatoes, and he looked at Peggy and he said, "What on earth has happened to you? You look like you saw a ghost." And she said, "Well, I think I did." And she told him what had happened. And he said, "Ah, Peggy, it's just some neighborhood trickster playing a trick on you. No way, I'll prove it to you." And he dashed over to the oatmeal chest, and before he could get there and put his hand on it, Peggy knocked him back gently, and she said, "No, just in case." And she opened it up, and sure wasn't the chest full to the brim with lovely, clean, perfect oats. They both drew in a breath. "Neil," she said, "it's Halloween night, and you know they do be going about on this night, you know that." And he said, "I now see. You're right, Peggy. Sure you were visited by someone quite special tonight." Well, after that, Peggy put a lock on the chest, and she guarded it very carefully. They were so careful about that chest for 5 years. And you know, the wonderful thing is, she filled many a bag, a big, heavy bag from that chest for neighbors who needed a little help. She gave freely. She never begrudged a single thing to any neighbors all that time. Well, after about 5 years had passed, 1 year between Christmas and Little Christmas, so the Feast of the Epiphany, somewhere in that time, in the darkest part really of the year, Peggy got word that one of their neighbors was dying, and so she threw a shawl around her and she fled out into the night to help. And she left the oatmeal chest left it open. She left it open. And Neil came in, and there was a sick calf in the barn, and he wanted to just grab a handful of oats, and without thinking, he put his hand in the oatmeal chest and grabbed a handful of oats and went out to help the calf. Well, when Peggy came home, she was ready to make some oats and tell Neil all about their old neighbor who had just died, and she opened the chest, and sure enough, it was empty, right down to just a little bit of dust and straw, just a few stray flakes of oats. She said, "Neil, you wouldn't have put your hand in the chest, would you?" He said, "Oh my gracious, my lord, I did. There was a sick calf to feed, and without thinking, that's what I did." And she said, "Well, Neil, it can't be helped. That's all right." And from that day until the day of their death, there was never any luck with that oatmeal chest again. Sinné mar scéalsa má tá bréag an bíú. That's my story. If there's a lie in it, so be it. Now, my friends, that's how Donncha Ó Baoill told the story. And here's where I want to introduce a little wrinkle. In Irish tradition, stories are multiples. You don't ever just have one version of a story. In fact, in the notes to the scéal, Sean O'Hockey tells us he makes a few comparisons to other versions of the same story. He also tells us that he thinks that this story is greatly influenced by written short story forms, and I would have to agree. You can tell that that the narrator of this story is a school teacher and well-read. The shape of it is a little bit different. And we know that there are many, many versions of this story. There's a saying I come back to again and again, and I want you to take it to heart. Tá rá leagán gach scéal, agus rá leagán déag amhrán. There's 2 versions of every story and 12 of every song. And sometimes that's reversed. There's 2 versions of every song and 12 of every story. The idea there is that there's not ever just one way of telling a story. So I want to play with Donnacha's story a little bit, the way that he told it. First, I want to think, why is it a good idea to keep it just as it is? Why should it end the way it does? I think it's an important story because fairy gifts and resources of all kinds are precious, and they do run out. They do run out, and we're told in this story that you can have something for quite a long time and that it can run out. And you need to take great care with your resources. I would say that is one of the most important messages, especially in the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, that Irish people were conveying through many stories, was be thoughtful with your resources. So in that sense, I really can see why Donncha ends his story with that. From that day until the day they died, the day of their death, they had no luck with the oatmeal chest. It's over. Now, I want to share with you an alternative ending, and we'll talk about it after. After they discovered that there wasn't so much as a scraping, just not even one bowl of oats left in the oatmeal chest, they had to understand fully that the luck they had enjoyed for 5 years had run out. There would be no more oats in the oatmeal chest. But the real magic happened to them, which is all of those bags of oats that Peggy had gladly given to her neighbors came back to them in ways that were beautiful. The old couple, people observed them and they saw that their fortunes had changed. They saw that they seemed to have a lot less than they used to in the old days, that they seemed to have had to tighten their belts. And so little by little, the gifts came in, and they were gifts of company, of kindness, of food, and of help. And in that way, with those beautiful gifts, they found that they had friends and neighbors and kindness, and it turns out that was more than enough. And that, my friends, is the end. And they all lived, of course, happily ever after. Now, why can we tell the story that way? Well, we can tell this story in a lot of ways, and other stories end differently. But I think why we can tell this story with this ending is because a story about a resource or a gift is never just about that gift. It's about what we do with the gift. And in this case, Peggy and Neil shared the gift. They didn't just keep it to themselves, they shared it. So I think it's logical, I think it only makes sense that those with whom they shared, at least some of them, would share with them in time. You know, when I grew up, I would hear people tell stories about failure, someone who had done something wrong or some kind of they'd made a mistake. And I can remember people around me saying, well, that's it, it's over for him. He'll never be lucky again, or he'll never have that again. He's ruined it all. That's it for him. And that was the end of that story. But I'll tell you this, I would inquire later, well, whatever happened to that man? Whatever happened to him? Well, it turns out he left that town where he lived and he remarried someone and he started a new business and he was living pretty well somewhere else. So that taught me something, that the story really isn't over when someone says it's over, especially when somebody is sort of taking a little pleasure and that was it. He did the wrong thing and now it's over for him. Guess what? It really is not over. The story continues until we say it's over. We have that power. We have that ability. We have the ability to decide what's in our story just as much as we have this idea of leagán, of version. So I think all of us can step into the storyteller's chair or role and say, I want to decide what story I prefer telling. Where do I end the story? What do I include in the story? And certainly if I've received gifts, how did they go forward? How have I used those gifts? Maybe if it seems that the gifts have come to an end, we're really in the middle. So I hope that encourages you to think about your own stories. I want to ask you, have you ever had a story that seemed like it was the end? You might have thought, that's the end of that story, that's it. But really, it was the middle or even a beginning. I'd love to hear from you. Please share in the comments. It's a joy to see your ingenuity, your kindness, just your wonderful joy and insight. We'd love to have that. And please like this video. Honestly, it helps me so much. And if you haven't, please subscribe. We'd love to have you. It costs you nothing. It's free. And it really helps me and it helps this channel. And I love being connected with all of you. So I hope you'll think about that story this week and all the magic that you are making with your own stories. I'll see you next week, my friends. Slán go fóill lín. Goodbye for a little while.